Have you ever felt like some people didn't want you around? Imagine working in a place you love, but instead of having a good environment, you face disdainful looks and hurtful comments. This is the story of Jessica, who works at St. Anne's Medical Center and was there for a purpose, but soon realized that not everyone believed in her potential. The hospital corridors hummed with the constant sound of hurried footsteps and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. It was early morning, yet the halls of St. Anne's Medical Center already pulsed with the energy of an intense day. Doctors, nurses, and staff moved in synchrony, like pieces of a vast machine, each tasked with saving lives. Amid the bustling scene, Dr. Catherine Kate Reed walked with her usual air of authority. Her presence was commanding, the kind that made people move out of the way without her even having to say a word. She wore her pristine white coat like a badge of honor, a reminder that she was not just a doctor, but the doctor, the best in her field. Kate's reputation at St. Anne's was well earned. She was a brilliant surgeon, with years of experience and countless lives saved. But beneath the admiration there was fear. Colleagues and subordinates respected her skill, but feared her cold, unrelenting demeanor. To Kate, medicine was not about feelings or compassion. It was about precision, control, and results. She was known for her brutal honesty, sharp tongue, and often her complete lack of patience for mistakes. Mistakes cost lives, and in Kate's world, there was no room for error. Today, as she entered the hospital's main ward, her mind was focused entirely on the surgery she was scheduled to perform later that morning. It was a high-stakes procedure on a high-profile patient. Everything had to be flawless. She was mentally running through the steps when she noticed a young nurse at the far end of the hall. Jessica Jess Evans was leaning over a patient's chart, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was only her third month at St. Anne's, but the weight of her responsibilities already felt crushing. She was determined, eager to prove herself, yet the intensity of the hospital made her doubt her every move. Unlike Kate, who exuded confidence, Jess was all nerves. Every shift felt like a new test, and today she was about to face her toughest one yet. Kate's sharp eyes narrowed as she watched Jess fumble with the chart. From across the room, she could already sense something was wrong. Without missing a beat, Kate approached, her footsteps echoing ominously in the sterile space. Jess felt the change in the air before she even saw Kate coming. The tension rose in her chest as she heard the rapid, clipped footsteps. This wasn't going to be good. She could feel it. And it wasn't just the fact that Kate was her superior. There was something else. An undercurrent of disdain that seemed to radiate from the doctor whenever she saw Jess. It wasn't anything she could point to directly. No overt words, no obvious insults, but the microaggressions were there. The way Kate's eyes always narrowed just a little more when she spoke to Jess. The way her tone turned sharper, more condescending. "Evans!" Kate's voice sliced through the air, causing Jess to nearly drop the clipboard in her hands. The young nurse turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest as she faced the intimidating doctor. "Yes, Doctor." "Reed," Jess replied, trying to steady her voice. She could feel the judgment in Kate's gaze before the woman even spoke. "What exactly are you doing?" Kate asked, her tone laced with disdain as she glanced at the patient lying in the bed. He was an elderly man, unconscious but stable, his frail body hooked up to various machines. "I was just checking the patient's vitals, I assume," Kate interrupted, not interested in explanations. "Tell me, Nurse Evans, do you know the protocol for monitoring a post-op patient in this condition?" Her voice was cold, clinical, but there was something else beneath it. A subtle edge, a silent accusation that Jess wasn't capable, wasn't competent enough for the job. Jess felt it like a slap in the face. Jess hesitated, feeling the familiar burn of anxiety rise in her throat. She knew the answer, of course she did, but under the weight of Kate's stare, the words seemed to evaporate from her mind. I was just about to... You were about to make a critical mistake," Kate snapped, cutting her off again. "This patient is fragile. Every second counts. I expect perfection from my staff, and what I see right now is incompetence." The word hit Jess like a physical blow. She could feel the eyes of the other nurses and doctors in the room, all watching the exchange, and the humiliation was unbearable. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What could she say? Kate was the top surgeon, revered by all. Who was she? A black nurse still trying to find her footing in a predominantly white, male-dominated hospital to argue. "I suggest you review your training, Nurse Evans," Kate continued mercilessly, "before you make another mistake that could cost a life." The phrase was dripping with a thinly veiled contempt, and Jess knew this wasn't just about a supposed mistake. It was about power, who had it and who didn't. Jess's face flushed red, and her hands clenched around the clipboard she was still holding. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to tell Kate that she was wrong, that she wasn't incompetent, but the fear of making things worse kept her silent. As Kate turned her back and walked away, Jess felt the weight of shame settling over her like a heavy blanket. As Kate left the ward, she didn't give Jess another thought. The young nurse was just another weak link in the system, one that needed to either shape up or be cut loose. There was no time to waste on fragility. Kate had a surgery to prepare for, and her mind quickly shifted back to the task at hand. She was known for her impeccable work, and today would be no different. But as the hours passed and Jess remained by the patient's side, she couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. The patient, an older man named Mr. Turner, lay motionless, his shallow breaths the only sign of life. Jess felt a deep connection to him, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because he reminded her of her own father, who had passed away just a few years ago. Or maybe it was because, in this cold, indifferent hospital, Mr. Turner was one of the few patients who didn't just feel like a number on a chart. Jess's mind raced with thoughts of how she could have handled the situation differently. She wasn't perfect, but she cared deeply. And that should matter, shouldn't it? But under Dr. Reed's leadership, it seemed like caring wasn't enough. You had to be flawless, and Jess knew she wasn't. The day dragged on, with Kate moving from surgery to surgery, commanding every room she entered. Meanwhile, Jess kept a silent vigil by Mr. Turner's side, checking his vitals, adjusting his IV, and hoping, somehow, that she could make up for whatever mistake she'd been accused of. By the time Kate and Jess crossed paths again, it was late in the evening. The hospital had quieted down, but the tension between them remained palpable. As Kate passed by the patient's room, she glanced inside, her eyes falling on Jess once again. There was something about the nurse's posture, the way she hovered protectively over the patient, that made Kate pause for the briefest of moments. But she dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it had come. She had more important things to worry about than a disgruntled nurse. What neither of them knew, however, was that the fate of the man lying between them would soon collide with their own in ways neither could have imagined. The events of the next few days would tear open wounds that went far deeper than professional differences, exposing long-buried pain, prejudices, and a connection that would change everything. The cool, antiseptic air of the hospital wrapped around Jess like a shroud as she watched Mr. Turner breathe in shallow, uneven gasps. The machines around his bed beeped rhythmically, a cold reminder of his fragility. Jess sat next to him, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted his blanket. The humiliation from earlier still weighed heavily on her chest, burning like an open wound. Kate Reed's words echoed in her mind. Incompetence. She hadn't made a mistake. She was sure of it now. The vitals were stable, the patient had been resting as expected, and the post-op instructions were followed to the letter. But in the harsh reality of St. Anne's, Jess's competence wasn't the issue. It was her place, her skin, the unspoken rules of the hierarchy that suffocated her every day. No matter how hard she worked, how much she studied, or how kind she was to her patients, it was never enough in the eyes of someone like Dr. Kate Reed. Jess leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees as she stared at the frail man before her. His thinning hair and wrinkled skin reminded her of her father in the months before he passed. Frail, exhausted, and slowly fading. There was something about the way Mr. Turner lay there, so helpless, that tugged at her heart. She had no idea why she felt such a strong connection to him, but she couldn't shake it. Maybe it was because she saw in him the same vulnerability that she herself felt every day in the hospital. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from her mother. "How was work today, baby? Hanging in there?" Jess smiled weakly at the screen. Her mother always tried to stay optimistic, though she knew full well how much her daughter was struggling. Jess's parents had been proud when she got the job at St. Anne's, the prestigious hospital where everyone dreamed of working. But over the last few months, her mother had seen the toll it was taking on Jess. How tired she was, how distant she'd become, and how the spark in her eyes was slowly dimming. Jess quickly typed back, "Long day, I'm all right, talk later, love you." She slipped the phone back into her pocket before leaning over Mr. Turner again, checking his IV and taking note of his vitals. For now, they were stable, but he hadn't regained consciousness since the surgery. She found herself talking to him in soft whispers, almost as if she was speaking to her father again, wishing she could say the things she never had the chance to say before he passed. "I'm sorry," Jess whispered to the unconscious man. "I'm trying so hard, I promise. I'm not giving up. Not yet." The door to the room creaked open, and Jess quickly straightened up. For a moment, her heart jumped, thinking it was Dr. Reed coming back to check on her, to criticize her again. But it wasn't Kate. It was Dr. Malcolm Parker, one of the more approachable surgeons in the hospital. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, always quick with words of encouragement for the nursing staff. Jess felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Hey, Jess," Malcolm greeted softly, stepping into the room. "I just came to check on Mr. Turner. How's he doing?" Jess exhaled slowly, grateful for his presence. "Stable, but no changes yet. He's still not waking up." Dr. Parker nodded, his expression thoughtful as he glanced over the monitors. "It was a tough surgery. His body's been through a lot, but he's hanging in there. You're doing a great job with him, by the way." Jess smiled faintly. "Thanks, Dr. Parker. That means a lot." He looked at her with a concerned expression, noticing the fatigue in her eyes. "You should get some rest, Jess. It's been a long shift." Jess shook her head. "I'll stay a little longer, I don't mind." Dr. Parker didn't push her, sensing there was more beneath the surface. He gave her a nod of understanding before heading toward the door. But before he left, he paused, turning back to her with a soft voice. "If you ever need to talk, Jess, I'm here. Don't let this place eat you alive, okay?" She nodded silently, unable to trust her voice. As the door clicked shut behind him, the silence returned, but it felt heavier now. Jess leaned back in her chair, staring at the floor. Dr. Parker's kindness was a stark contrast to the cold indifference she felt from Dr. Reed, but it only made her more aware of how isolated she was in this place. Hours passed, and the hospital's busy hum quieted as the night shift took over. Jess stayed by Mr. Turner's side, refusing to leave him. The lights in the hallway dimmed, and the steady beep of the heart monitor became a kind of background noise that lulled her into a trance. She replayed the events of the day over and over again in her mind, each time feeling the weight of Kate's words pressing down harder on her chest. Kate Reed. Even thinking her name made Jess feel a mix of anger and sadness. There was no denying Kate's brilliance, but the woman had a way of making Jess feel like she was invisible, or worse, like she was an obstacle, something that didn't belong. It wasn't just the critique earlier that day, but a pattern Jess had noticed. The dismissive looks, the lack of acknowledgement, the way Kate would speak down to her, often cutting her off mid-sentence, never giving her a chance to explain herself. And it wasn't just Jess. She saw how Kate treated others, especially those who didn't fit the mold of what a top nurse or doctor should look like in her eyes. It stung deeper than Jess was willing to admit. Growing up, she had faced her share of discrimination, but she had thought, naively perhaps, that in the world of medicine, talent and hard work would be enough. She had believed that the value of saving lives transcended race or background. But reality had a cruel way of showing her otherwise. No matter how qualified she was, how compassionate, there would always be people like Kate Reed who saw her skin before they saw her skills. As the night crept on, Jess found herself drifting off to sleep in the chair beside Mr. Turner's bed. But just as her eyes began to close, a loud, sharp beep from one of the monitors jolted her awake. She shot up in her seat, her heart racing. Mr. Turner's heart rate was spiking, alarmingly so. Jess's pulse quickened as she immediately went into action, pressing the call button for assistance and reaching for the emergency kit. She checked his IV, his oxygen, and the monitors again, her hands shaking slightly with the rush of adrenaline. Within moments, another nurse rushed in, followed by a resident doctor. "What's going on?" the resident asked, his voice thick with urgency. "His heart rate spiked out of nowhere," Jess replied, her eyes focused on the patient. "We need to stabilize him now." The room became a flurry of controlled chaos as they worked to bring Mr. Turner's vitals back to normal. Jess's mind raced as she administered medication, her hands moving quickly but methodically, just as she'd been trained. But in the back of her mind, Kate's voice lingered, accusing her, undermining her confidence. She couldn't make a mistake, not again, not in front of another doctor. Minutes passed like hours, but finally the monitors began to calm. Mr. Turner's heart rate steadied and the immediate danger passed. Jess exhaled slowly, her entire body sagging with relief. "Well done, Jess," the resident said, patting her shoulder. "That was a close one." Jess nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had done everything right. She had saved him, at least for now. But she knew that it wouldn't be enough. Not for someone like Kate Reed. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how many patients she helped, it would never be enough. The resident and the other nurse left the room, leaving Jess alone once again with Mr. Turner. She sank into the chair beside his bed, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had just saved a man's life, and yet all she could feel was the crushing weight of doubt and fear. In the stillness of the room, Jess allowed herself a moment to let the tears fall. She wiped them away quickly, ashamed of her own vulnerability. She couldn't afford to break down. Not here, not now. But as she sat in the dim light, her hands still trembling, she knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep living like this, working in fear, always second-guessing herself, always feeling like she didn't belong. She had fought too hard to get here, and she wasn't going to let someone like Kate Reed take it away from her. Yet deep down, a part of her wondered, was it a battle she could ever win? The early hours of the morning crept in slowly, the dark sky outside the hospital windows a reflection of the weight Jess carried in her heart. Mr. Turner had stabilized for now, but Jess couldn't shake the feeling that the crisis wasn't over. Exhaustion tugged at her limbs, but she refused to leave his side. She sat at the edge of his bed, watching the subtle rise and fall of his chest, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the blanket. The darkness of the room was comforting, but it couldn't hide the conflict raging inside her. She kept replaying the events of the night in her mind, how close Mr. Turner had come to the edge and how she had fought to pull him back. Jess had done everything right. Her training, her instincts, her skills, all of it had led her to that moment, and she had saved him. Yet the invisible weight of Dr. Reed's judgment still clung to her, suffocating the pride she should have felt. Somewhere in the recesses of her mind, Jess wondered if she would ever be seen for who she truly was. Not just a nurse, not just a black woman in a predominantly white, high-pressure hospital, but someone who had earned her place. Someone who could stand on her own, without constantly being questioned, doubted, diminished. The quiet was interrupted by the soft creak of the door. Jess looked up, expecting to see another nurse or perhaps Dr. Parker, but her heart dropped as Kate Reed stepped into the room. Her presence filled the space like an uninvited storm. Jess quickly stood, instinctively straightening her uniform, her body tensing in preparation for whatever came next. Kate's expression was unreadable as she approached the bed. She didn't acknowledge Jess at first, her eyes scanning the monitors and the sleeping figure of Mr. Turner. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady beeping of the machines. "How is he?" Kate's voice was quiet, almost detached as she finally spoke. "Stable," Jess replied, her voice tight. "His heart rate spiked earlier, but we managed to bring it down. I stayed with him all night." Kate nodded slightly, still not looking at her. She flipped through the chart at the end of the bed, her fingers moving methodically over the pages. There was a coldness in her that made the air around her feel heavy. Jess could feel the unspoken criticism hanging in the air, waiting to pounce. "I see," Kate said after a long pause. "And did you follow the protocol exactly as it was written?" Jess blinked, the familiar sting of anger rising in her chest. Of course, Kate couldn't offer a single word of encouragement, not even a moment of recognition for the work Jess had done. The question was laced with the same underlying suspicion she had come to expect. "I did everything by the book, Dr. Reed," Jess replied, her voice firm. She wasn't going to back down this time. "His vitals were unstable for a moment, but I acted quickly and got him back under control." Finally, Kate looked up, her icy blue eyes locking onto Jess's. The silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. Kate tilted her head slightly, as if appraising Jess, searching for something, some flaw, some mistake to pounce on. "Well," Kate said, her voice slow and deliberate, "you may have gotten lucky this time, Evans, but luck doesn't last in this field. You should have notified me immediately when his vitals started to change. Any delay could have been fatal." Jess's breath caught in her throat. Luck? The word hit her harder than she expected. After everything she had done, staying up all night, carefully monitoring every change in Mr. Turner's condition, following every protocol to the letter, Kate had the nerve to reduce it all to luck. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and it was more than Jess could take. "I didn't need luck, Dr. Reed," Jess replied, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "I knew exactly what I was doing. I've been trained for this. And if I hadn't acted as quickly as I did, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." Kate's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. There was a flicker of something, surprise maybe, in her expression, as if she hadn't expected Jess to push back. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same cold, unyielding mask. "You may think you know everything because you've had a few good shifts," Kate said, her voice dangerously calm. "But there's a reason I'm the one in charge, and you're not. In this hospital, we don't get to make mistakes, and I won't have you risking my patients' lives because you think you've got it all figured out." Jess felt the words like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. She bit down on her lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She wasn't going to let Kate see her cry. Not now, not ever. But something inside her had reached its breaking point. The weight of months of silent resentment, of being judged for her every move, of being seen as less than, it all came rushing to the surface in a flood of raw emotion. Jess could no longer hold it back. "Is that what this is about?" Jess's voice cracked as she spoke, the tears she'd been holding back for so long finally spilling over. "You think I'm not good enough, that I don't belong here, but I've worked just as hard as anyone else. I've fought to be here every single day." Kate's expression didn't change, but there was a slight stiffening in her posture, a tightening of her jaw. Jess pressed on, unable to stop now that the words had started flowing. "You don't see me," Jess continued, her voice growing stronger though her tears still fell. "You've never seen me. All you see is someone to blame, someone to control. But I'm more than that, Dr. Reed. I'm more than just a nurse you can walk all over, and I won't let you do it anymore." The room fell into a heavy silence. Jess's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she waited for Kate's response. Part of her regretted the outburst almost immediately, but another part of her, the part that had been suffocating under the pressure for so long, felt liberated. She had spoken her truth finally, and there was no taking it back now. Kate stood still, her expression unreadable, her eyes locked on Jess. For a moment it seemed as though she might say something, something cutting, something cruel, but instead she simply closed the chart and turned toward the door. "I'll be watching your performance closely, Evans," Kate said without turning around. Her voice was cold, as sharp as ever. We'll see how long you last." And with that, she walked out, leaving Jess standing alone in the dim room. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound reverberating in the emptiness that followed. Jess stood frozen, her breath shallow and uneven, as the tears continued to flow down her cheeks. The confrontation had taken everything out of her, and yet, as the last of Kate's footsteps faded into the distance, a strange sense of relief settled over her. She had stood her ground, she had spoken her truth, and no matter what came next, Jess knew that she wouldn't allow herself to be silent again. But the weight of Kate's final words still hung in the air, a reminder of the precarious position Jess now found herself in. She had challenged the most powerful doctor in the hospital, and there would be consequences. She wasn't naive enough to think that things would get easier from here. If anything, they would get worse, much worse. Jess sank into the chair beside Mr. Turner's bed, wiping the tears from her face. She didn't know what would happen next, or how she would navigate the storm that was surely coming. But for now, all she could do was breathe and hold on to the one thing she had left, her integrity. And somewhere deep inside, as the night stretched on and the machines continued their rhythmic beeping, Jess realized that maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The day after Jess's confrontation with Dr. Kate Reed unfolded in slow, heavy breaths, like the calm before a storm. Jess had barely slept, her mind replaying every word she had said, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Challenging someone like Kate was dangerous. It wasn't just about bruising egos, it was about survival in a hospital where power dynamics ruled the halls like a silent undercurrent. Jess had worked so hard to get here, had clawed her way through years of study, sacrifice, and unspoken barriers. She couldn't afford to lose it all now, but she couldn't back down either. Jess arrived at St. Anne's early that morning, despite her exhaustion. She knew she couldn't afford to show weakness, especially not now when Kate would be watching her every move with even sharper scrutiny. As she walked through the corridors, her colleagues offered her sympathetic glances, though none dared to ask what had happened the night before. Word traveled fast in the hospital, and by now everyone knew she had stood up to Dr. Reed. The tension in the air was palpable. Jess tried to shake off the anxiety gripping her as she entered Mr. Turner's room. The air was still and thick with the scent of antiseptic. She could hear the steady rhythm of the machines, each beep a reminder of the man's fragile state. His face was pale, his eyes still closed, and he lay motionless, just as he had been the night before. She paused by the doorway, watching him. The connection she felt to Mr. Turner had only deepened, though she couldn't explain why. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of her father's last days, the pain of watching someone you love fade away, powerless to stop it. But with Mr. Turner, there was something more, something Jess couldn't quite put her finger on, as though the universe had placed this man in her care for a reason she hadn't yet uncovered. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Malcolm Parker, who entered the room with his usual calm presence. He gave Jess a warm smile as he glanced over Mr. Turner's vitals. "Morning, Jess," he greeted softly. "How's our patient doing today?" Jess returned his smile, grateful for the kindness in his eyes. "Still stable, but no changes. I was hoping he'd show some signs of waking up by now." Dr. Parker nodded, a look of quiet concern crossing his face as he checked the monitors. "It's hard to say how long it'll take. His body's been through a lot, but you're doing a great job keeping him stable. He's lucky to have you looking after him." Jess's chest tightened at his words. "Thanks, Dr. Parker, that means a lot." She paused for a moment, then hesitated before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What's his story?" Jess asked, nodding toward Mr. Turner. "I've been with him for a while now, but no one's told me much about him. He doesn't seem to have any family visiting, and I haven't seen any personal information in his file." "Dr. T." Parker's expression shifted, a shadow passing over his eyes. He glanced at Mr. Turner, then back at Jess, as though weighing what to say. "Mr. Turner's case is complicated," he said slowly. "He was transferred to us after a heart attack, and his surgery was a last-ditch effort to save him. No one really knows much about him. He doesn't have any listed next of kin, no family contacts. It's like he just appeared one day with no history, no connections." Jess frowned. Her curiosity piqued. "That's odd. No family at all." "Not that we've been able to find," Dr. Parker replied, his voice low. "I've tried reaching out to different hospitals, even looked through old records, but there's nothing. He's a bit of a mystery." A cold shiver ran down Jess's spine. There was something deeply unsettling about Mr. Turner's situation, as if his presence in the hospital was a puzzle waiting to be solved. She stared at the man lying in the bed, her thoughts racing. Why did he feel so familiar to her? And why did it feel like there was something important that she was missing? Before Jess could ask more, the door to the room swung open again. This time, it was Kate Reed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly as Kate stepped inside, her sharp eyes sweeping over the scene. Jess felt her heart pound in her chest, the weight of their confrontation from the previous night still fresh in her mind. She braced herself for another barrage of criticism, but Kate didn't address Jess directly. She barely glanced at her. Instead, she went straight to Mr. Turner's chart, flipping through the pages with quick, methodical precision. The silence was deafening. Dr. Parker cleared his throat, clearly sensing the tension. "Good morning, Kate," he said, trying to break the ice. "Just checking in on Mr. Turner. His vitals have been stable all night." Kate nodded curtly, not lifting her eyes from the chart. "Good," she replied, her voice flat. "I'll be handling his case from here on out. I want full control over his treatment plan." Jess's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what that meant. Kate was going to take over, micromanaging every detail, leaving Jess no room to prove herself, no room to make any decisions on her own. It was Kate's way of asserting dominance, making it clear that she was in charge, and Jess was nothing more than an underling. But Jess couldn't let it go. Not this time, not after everything. "Dr. Reed," Jess began, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "I've been working closely with Mr. Turner for the past few days. I know his case inside and out. I'd like to continue being part of his care team." Kate's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Jess. There was a flicker of surprise, but it quickly turned to cold amusement. "You?" Kate said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think you're qualified to handle a case like this?" Jess's jaw tightened. "I've been handling it just fine so far. I know this patient. I've been with him every step of the way." Kate stepped closer, her gaze piercing through Jess like a blade. "Let me remind you, Nurse Evans, that you're here to assist, not to lead. You don't get to make decisions. That's my job." Jess's pulse raced. Every fiber of her being screamed to back down, to avoid another confrontation, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when she had already come this far. "I understand that, Dr. Reed," Jess replied, her voice calm but firm. "But I've spent more time with this patient than anyone else. I care about his well-being, and I want to be involved in his treatment plan." Kate's eyes darkened, her lips curling into a sneer. "Care? Do you think care is what saves lives in this hospital? Care doesn't matter when you're standing in an operating room, cutting open a chest and holding someone's heart in your hands. Skill matters, precision matters, experience matters. And you, Evans, are lacking in all three." Jess felt the sting of those words deep in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She stood her ground, meeting Kate's icy stare with her own determination. "I may not be a surgeon, Dr. Reed," Jess said quietly, "but I care about this patient, and that should count for something." For a moment, the room was utterly still. Dr. Parker looked between the two women, tension thick in the air. Kate's jaw clenched, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, the door slamming shut behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jess exhaled slowly, her entire body trembling with the adrenaline of the moment. She had stood up to Kate again. She had risked everything, her job, her future, her reputation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough, that Kate would find a way to crush her no matter how hard she fought. Dr. Parker approached her gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did well, Jess," he said softly. "But be careful. Kate doesn't take challenges lightly." Jess nodded, her throat tight. "I know, but I had to try." As Dr. Parker left the room, Jess turned back to Mr. Turner, her mind spinning with questions. Who was this man, and why did she feel so connected to him? There was something about his presence that unsettled her, something that felt unfinished, like a chapter in a story she hadn't yet read. She reached for his hand, her fingers lightly brushing against his cold skin. For a brief moment she thought she saw his eyelids flutter, just the faintest movement, like a whisper in the dark. Jess's breath caught in her throat. Was he waking up? Her heart raced as she leaned closer, watching his face, waiting for any sign of consciousness. But as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Mr. Turner remained still, his breathing shallow and even, as if nothing had happened. Jess sat back in her chair, her pulse still pounding. She couldn't explain what she had just seen, but something told her that Mr. Turner was on the edge of waking, and when he did, the secrets he carried, whatever they were, would come to light. And Jess had the feeling those secrets would change everything. Jess sat motionless beside Mr. Turner, her fingers lightly brushing the blanket that covered his frail form. The stillness in the room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around her, pushing her thoughts into a tight, narrow space. The strange flicker of movement she had seen in his eyelids lingered in her mind, haunting her. Could he really be waking up, or had her exhausted, emotional mind just imagined it? She couldn't be sure anymore. The lines between what was real and what was her own wishful thinking were beginning to blur. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again, breaking the silence. It was another message from her mother. "Call me when you can, sweetie. I'm worried about you." Jess sighed softly, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she hadn't told her mother the full truth about how things were going at St. Anne's. Her mom had worked so hard to support Jess through nursing school, taking extra shifts at her cleaning job, sacrificing so much to see Jess succeed. How could she tell her that even now, after all their hard work, she felt invisible, that no matter how much she tried to stand out, it was like she was fighting a battle she was destined to lose? Jess tucked the phone away, her eyes drawn once again to Mr. Turner. She stared at him for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of everything. The mystery of who he was gnawed at her. No family, no records, no past that anyone could find. How could someone just disappear like that? And why did she feel such an inexplicable connection to him? There had to be more to this than coincidence. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Dr. Parker entering the room again. His expression was serious, but there was a warmth in his eyes that always managed to calm her, if only for a moment. "Hey, Jess," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "Any changes?" Jess shook her head, her eyes still on Mr. Turner. "Nothing since this morning. I thought he moved for a second earlier, but I don't know if it was real or if I just imagined it." Dr. Parker nodded thoughtfully, stepping up beside her to check the monitors. "It's possible. Sometimes patients in this condition can have subtle responses before they fully regain consciousness." He paused, looking down at Mr. Turner with a furrowed brow. "But with him, I don't know. There's something different here." Jess glanced at him, sensing the hesitation in his voice. "What do you mean?" Dr. Parker sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've seen a lot of cases like this in my time, but I've never seen one quite like his. There's something off. His body is healing, but there's no clear reason why he's still unconscious. And with no medical history to guide us, it's like we're flying blind." Jess swallowed hard, her unease growing. "Do you think he'll wake up?" Dr. Parker was silent for a moment, his eyes focused on the patient. "I honestly don't know. I'd like to think so, but there's no way to predict it. The brain is a complex thing." The uncertainty in his voice sent a chill down Jess's spine. She hated this feeling, this helplessness, this not knowing. It reminded her too much of watching her father slip away in that hospital bed years ago, every passing day filled with the same agonizing question: will today be the day? "I'm going to keep monitoring him closely," Jess said, more to herself than to Dr. Parker. "I don't want to miss anything." Dr. Parker smiled gently at her. "I know you will. You're doing a great job, Jess. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His words were kind, but they couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in Jess's gut. She appreciated Dr. Parker's support more than he probably realized, but the shadow of Kate's harshness still hung over her like a dark cloud, reminding her that no matter how hard she worked, it might never be enough in the eyes of people like Kate Reed. "Thanks, Dr. Parker," Jess murmured, her voice tight. He gave her a sympathetic look before turning to leave. "Hang in there, Jess. We'll figure this out." As the door closed behind him, Jess leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Her mind was racing with 1,000 different thoughts, but one question kept coming back to her over and over. Who is this man? Unable to shake her growing sense of curiosity, Jess reached for Mr. Turner's chart. She had already looked through it a dozen times, but maybe there was something she'd missed, some small detail that could give her a clue. Flipping through the pages, she scanned the notes, looking for anything that stood out, and then she saw it. A small, handwritten note tucked in the margin of one of the pages. It was faint, barely legible, but it caught her eye. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words. "Patient has old scar, left side of chest, possible past surgery." Jess's heart raced as she lifted Mr. Turner's hospital gown carefully, her fingers trembling. And there it was. A thin, faded scar running down the left side of his chest, just below his collarbone. It was old, years old, but unmistakable. How had she missed this before? A surge of questions flooded her mind. If Mr. Turner had undergone surgery before, why wasn't there any record of it? Who had performed it, and why had no one mentioned it? The scar raised more questions than answers, but it was a clue that this man's past wasn't as blank as it seemed. Jess couldn't shake the feeling that this was important, that it meant something. She needed to know more. As she sat there, deep in thought, the door swung open again, but this time it wasn't Dr. Parker or another nurse. It was Kate. Her presence filled the room like a sudden gust of cold wind, sharp and unforgiving. Jess quickly lowered Mr. Turner's gown and stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea how much of her actions Kate had seen, but the tension between them crackled in the air. Kate's eyes flicked to the chart in Jess's hands, then back to her face. Her expression was unreadable, but Jess could feel the weight of her scrutiny. "Is there something you'd like to share, Nurse Evans?" Kate's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a challenge, a dare. Jess swallowed hard, gripping the chart tightly. She wasn't about to let Kate intimidate her this time. Not after everything. "I found something," Jess said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Mr. Turner has an old surgical scar on his chest. It wasn't in the initial notes. I think it might be important." Kate's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jess thought she saw a flicker of something, uncertainty maybe, in her expression, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. "A scar," Kate repeated, her tone dismissive. "And you think that changes anything?" Jess took a deep breath, refusing to back down. "It could. We don't know his full medical history. This could be a clue. We need to find out what kind of surgery he had, and why." Kate's lips pressed into a thin line, and she took a step closer to Jess, her gaze cold and unyielding. "What we need, Nurse Evans, is for you to remember your place. You're a nurse, not a doctor. Leave the diagnostics to me." Jess's chest tightened with anger, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm just trying to help." Kate's eyes bore into hers, and for a moment the room felt suffocating, but then, without another word, Kate turned and walked out, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Jess stood there, her heart pounding, her hands still trembling around the chart. She had expected Kate to push back, but there was something different in her reaction this time, something that felt like more than just professional condescension. There was a tension in Kate's voice, an urgency that Jess couldn't quite place. She glanced back at Mr. Turner, lying still and silent, and a thought occurred to her. What if Kate knows more than she's letting on? The hospital felt quieter than usual, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jess sat by Mr. Turner's bedside, her eyes fixed on his unmoving figure. The scar on his chest was like a silent scream, a piece of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together, but that she knew held the key to everything. Her mind raced with questions. How could a man with no family, no history, and no records end up here, in her care, with a past surgery no one seemed to know about? And why was Kate so dismissive of it? Jess's instincts told her something was wrong, something bigger than she could see. And the way Kate had reacted when she mentioned the scar, it wasn't just professional arrogance. It felt personal. Jess leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on Mr. Turner's. His skin was cold and still, but she could feel the faint pulse of life beneath it. She squeezed his hand gently, willing him to wake up, to give her the answer she so desperately needed. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Why does this feel so important?" Just as she was about to stand, the door opened again. But this time, instead of the usual sternness in Kate's face, there was something different, something softer, something fragile. Jess immediately sensed it, the subtle shift in the air. Kate didn't storm in, didn't bark orders or criticize. She simply stood there, lingering in the doorway for a moment, her eyes flickering between Jess and the unconscious man in the bed. "Dr. Reed?" Jess's voice was hesitant, uncertain of what to expect. Kate didn't respond right away. She stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. For the first time, Jess noticed the exhaustion in Kate's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly, the tension that seemed to drain from her as she looked at Mr. Turner. It was like watching a wall crumble, piece by piece. "Sit down," Kate said quietly, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Jess blinked, unsure of what was happening, but she obeyed, sitting back down in the chair beside Mr. Turner's bed. Kate moved closer, her eyes never leaving the man on the bed. The room was filled with an almost unbearable silence before Kate finally spoke again. "I know you've been wondering about him," Kate said softly, her voice distant, as if she was speaking to someone far away. "About why he's here, why no one knows anything about him." Jess nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The answers she had been searching for were finally within reach. Kate let out a long, shaky breath, her eyes still fixed on Mr. Turner. "His name is Thomas Turner, but no one calls him that. Not anymore." She paused, her voice trembling just slightly. "He's my father." Jess's breath caught in her throat. Her father? The revelation hit her like a tidal wave, crashing through her thoughts and leaving her stunned. She stared at Kate, trying to process the words, but they felt too heavy, too unreal. Kate's voice cracked as she continued. "He left when I was young, disappeared without a word. I spent years wondering where he went, why he abandoned us. My mother never spoke of him again. We pretended he didn't exist." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. "And then one day, I got a call. He was in another hospital, alone, sick, dying. They transferred him here to St. Anne's, and I didn't tell anyone who he was. I couldn't. I didn't want anyone to know." Jess's mind reeled. All this time, she had been caring for the father Kate had lost, the man whose absence had clearly haunted her for decades. And yet, Kate had said nothing, had buried the truth beneath layers of professionalism and control. The cold, unfeeling mask Kate wore now made sense. It had been a defense, a way to protect herself from the pain she had spent her entire life running from. "I've been waiting," Kate whispered, her voice breaking. "Waiting for him to wake up, so I could finally ask him why. Why he left us, why he never came back." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time since Jess had known her, Kate looked vulnerable. "But he hasn't woken up, and I don't know if he ever will." Jess felt a lump rise in her throat. The cold, distant Kate Reed she had known suddenly seemed so human, so raw. The woman who had humiliated her, who had criticized her at every turn, now stood before her as a daughter who had been abandoned and left with questions that may never be answered. "I'm so sorry," Jess said softly, her voice filled with empathy. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she wasn't sure if Kate would accept it. Kate's expression wavered, as if she was caught between the need to hold on to her composure and the desire to let go of everything she had been carrying. She finally sat down, pulling a chair close to the bed, her hands shaking slightly as she rested them on her lap. "I never wanted anyone to know," Kate admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Not about him, not about how broken my family was. I built my entire life around being perfect, around never showing weakness. I thought if I could control everything, if I could be the best, I wouldn't have to feel the pain. But it doesn't work like that, does it?" Jess shook her head gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "No, it doesn't." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before. It was quieter, softer, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared pain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jess looked at Kate, really looked at her, and saw a woman who had spent her entire life building walls to protect herself from the one thing she couldn't control, her own heart. And now, as she sat by the bedside of the father she had lost and found again, those walls were crumbling. Suddenly a soft gasp filled the room. Jess and Kate both froze, their eyes snapping to Mr. Turner. His chest rose slowly, more deliberately than before, and his eyelids fluttered. Jess's heart leaped into her throat as she stood up, rushing to his side. "Mr. Turner?" Jess whispered, her hand gripping his gently. Kate's breath hitched, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. She leaned forward, her hands trembling as they hovered over the bed, not daring to touch him yet. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Mr. Turner's eyes opened. His gaze was unfocused, distant, as though he was trying to remember where he was, who he was. He blinked a few times, his breathing shallow but steady. "Dad," Kate's voice cracked, the word escaping her lips like a prayer. For a moment, there was no response. But then, Mr. Turner's eyes shifted, locking onto Kate. Recognition flickered in his tired eyes, and his lips moved, though no sound came out at first. Jess felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with emotion. "Catherine," Mr. Turner rasped, his voice weak and fragile, but filled with the weight of years of silence. Kate let out a sob, her hand finally reaching for his. She grasped it tightly, her tears falling freely now, all the pain, all the anger, all the questions flooding out of her in a single breath. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here." In that moment, the walls Kate had spent so long building came crashing down, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to feel the grief, the longing, and the love that had been buried beneath her armor. Jess stepped back, giving them space. Her own heart was full, and though she hadn't expected it, tears streamed down her face as well. She had witnessed something beautiful, something raw and real, a daughter finding her father again after years of pain. The room was filled with the quiet sounds of breathing, of tears, of healing. And in that moment, Jess knew that not all wounds were physical. Some took years to heal, and some scars were carried deep inside. But standing there, watching Kate and Mr. Turner reunite, she realized that healing was possible if you allowed yourself to let go. And for the first time in a long time, Jess felt hopeful, not just for them, but for herself as well. Did this story touch your heart? If you felt the emotions, the tension, and the journey of healing with us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, emotional stories that will leave you thinking long after the credits roll. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us keep bringing you content that truly moves the soul. Thank you for watching.